So she's right, I've had it. It is very good. So hi, welcome to Build a Better Hiring Process with Design Thinking. My name is Crystal, and probably unlike most of the people in this room, I don't actually lead teams of developers. I lead teams of UX designers and product managers. Before working as a consultant, as I do today, I ran product and UX at a small startup, and I was there during a pretty high growth phase. I joined when it was about 15 people, and when I left 3 years later, not 13, sorry, it was about over 150. And so you can imagine in that time period, we had an opportunity to hire many different people onto our team. And for me, when I was a hiring manager for some of these positions, the first time I did it, I had no clue what I was doing. But because we were growing so often and we had to do it so many times, there was really an opportunity to get better at it over time. And as a designer, I started thinking, how can I use the tools in my toolkit that I use to design products in order to design a process that would improve over time? This was especially relevant to us as a startup because we didn't really have a very big brand as an employer to rely on. We really had to focus on our value proposition for why the opportunity we were offering would be unique to the candidate and specific to some of their own growth goals. So, what I want to talk to you about today is why this first mattered to me and how I got our senior leadership team to buy into investing the time and resources in this project. I'll talk about some of the human-centered design methods that I use in order to build a better hiring process, namely conducting user interviews, journey mapping the candidate experience, and also paper prototyping particular solutions. And not only doing that myself, but getting people who were unfamiliar to the world of design to participate and be a part of this process. And finally, I'll highlight 2 quick wins or solutions that organizations I've worked at and worked with have implemented into their own hiring process. And perhaps these could give you some ideas for things you can take back to your organization as well. So, why did I embark on this project to begin with? Well, I wonder, for some of you, the last time you interviewed for a job, did you ever feel kind of like, this? You were sitting there and you were wondering, why is this person asking me this question? What are they trying to get out of an answer to this question? And you may remember in your particular positions as tech leads that you've been on the other side of the table. You've interviewed candidates yourself. And you might have also felt maybe a different emotion as you went into that room. Maybe a small feeling of panic. As you shake their hand, that candidate's hand, you look at their face, and you're really struggling to remember which resume out of the 50 resumes you read the past week this face actually matches up to. I know I felt that way, both as the person being interviewed and as the person conducting the interview. I maybe wasn't quite sure what the intention behind certain questions were, or what the intention behind certain decisions as a part of the process were. And as an interviewer, I may have also felt like I didn't quite have the tools to conduct the interview very well and make a really good impression on a candidate that we really wanted to join the team. And so this led me to think about how can I apply some of the methods I know to make this process a little bit better. Because I learned very quickly, as I was doing this hiring, that hiring is pretty frustrating, it's also pretty stressful, and more often than not, it's really not very fun, both on the side of being the person interviewed or the person doing the interviewing. And if you're struggling to get your senior leadership to invest in the resources to make this process better, what you might find beyond just talking about how stressful it is, you could also talk about how expensive hiring is. Because the reality is, you're putting a lot of time and energy into hiring any candidate. Not only the time it takes for your team to be a part of the interview process, but also the opportunity costs, right? Because the time that someone spends interviewing a candidate in a way that's maybe not effective is also time they can't spend building a new feature for your product, building something that could have an exponential impact on your business. And so if you're struggling to really make the case to the managers above you about why you should spend time working on this in the first place, talk not only about the costs of having a less than effective interviewing process, but also the opportunity costs of not trying to improve it in the first place. So I started talking to some of the people at my company at the time, and I said, I want to do a 20% project on making our hiring process better. And the first question I got asked was, why? What are your goals for doing this? Well, the goal I set out was this hypothesis that if we built a more inclusive hiring process that was a little more intentional, and we used human-centered design methods, we would be able to achieve certain goals. Namely, we would be able to make sure that the process was hopefully a little less biased, and we would make sure that the process was maybe a little less frustrating for the candidate. And this would not only make their experience more delightful, it would hopefully also have a higher yield, which was the metric we were using to judge how often the candidate accepted an offer once we extended one. And so I laid out these as my goals: to first, cut the bias; to second, set expectations in order to increase the delightfulness of the candidate experience; and then third, to get to yes, to say that we were able to create an experience that was giving more insight to the candidate on what the job would entail, and being able to demonstrate the results of a company culture that would let them thrive, and hopefully that would increase our yield rate. So how did we actually do this? What did we do? Well, one of my responsibilities as someone who was leading the product and UX team would be to help lead an onboarding session. Every new hire went through a 2-day onboarding session where they were introduced to the company, all the different departments, what they did, and how in their particular role they would interact with these departments. And one of my responsibilities was to lead a 1-hour session to introduce to new hires what the UX team did and how we might be able to work with them. And so I did a little bit of competitive research before I took on this responsibility. I sat in on a couple of the sessions that some of my colleagues were running, and I noticed that for most of the other department heads, they had fairly long presentations where they would just walk through and explain a bunch of different concepts. And I thought, as the experience, if I were to imagine being a new person, it would probably be really exhausting to get that much information downloaded to me and just have to sit and listen to it. So I thought maybe I would try to make it a little more interactive, especially for someone, and this was probably the case for most of our new hires, they had not been a designer before, and not only that, most of them had never interacted with a UX designer before. Their main exposure to what they thought of as design was maybe a graphic designer or an interior designer, so they didn't quite know how UX worked. So I thought, what better way to introduce that than to make them learn about it through experiential learning? So in this onboarding session, I led interactive activities where I tried to introduce the concept of UX to new hires by allowing them to practice it. And I would not only talk about the different steps of the human-centered design process, I would have them conduct some of those activities on a particular design challenge. And in conjunction with my earlier goal of building a hiring process, I also thought this was a great opportunity to gather some data. So the design challenge I gave to them was, how might we improve the interview experience? Now this worked because in our organization, we had new people who were joining every 2 weeks, and sometimes these onboarding sessions were 8 to 10 people. So it was a really good setting to get that data in this way. And I had them go through a couple of these activities and conduct research on each other, so they had the experience of being a UXer for the first time with a topic that felt relevant to them. I mean, these were all people who had just joined the company and gone through the interview experience recently. The other important thing we did was we invited the talent team to be a part of the process. Now, typically in this 2-day onboarding session, there was a talent team member who was sitting in on most of these onboarding sessions with the new hires. That way they had a full picture of all the information new hires were being exposed to. And because they were in the room anyway, I invited them to participate in the activities too. And if you are a hiring manager at your organization, you know that it's really critical to work in partnership with your talent team. And by making sure they were in the room and interacting with the candidates as they were articulating these pain points, it made them more bought into the vision of thinking about, hey, some of these solutions we can totally implement tomorrow. And they're definitely a stakeholder you want to have on board in order to make that a reality. So what methods did we cover? We covered a couple introductory UX methods, including conducting research, mapping the candidate experience, paper prototyping solutions, and then shipping those solutions and iterating on them based on feedback. So first, conducting research. I explained to new hires that with any given human-centered design project, you want to start with some exploratory research. In our case, we focused on one particular research method, conducting user interviews, and our goal was to uncover candidate pain points. So in this 1-hour onboarding session, I set aside maybe about 5 to 7 minutes for a user research activity. I had new hires pair up, and I specifically made sure that people in different roles were paired up, because different roles went through typically different interview processes. I made sure that the activity was time-boxed, so people didn't, spend the whole time conducting research, because it's very realistic that if you're conducting user research that you can spend an entire hour just interviewing someone. In our case, we needed to time box the activity given the limitations. But if you wanted to run this activity in your own organization, instead of doing it through a 1-hour onboarding session, you could do a couple hours for a workshop. And then, therefore, you can adjust the time of the activities accordingly. And then the last and final thing I did in this phase was to make sure that people were coached on asking open-ended questions. So a lot of times when someone is conducting user research for the first time, it's very easy to phrase a question in a way that might accidentally be misleading. For example, if you wanted to uncover pain points in the candidate experience, it might be very easy to just ask, what did you like about this part of the process? The reality is, most of the time when you're conducting research, the person on the other end is pretty smart. They can probably guess that the thing you're asking about is something that you've worked on for a couple months, and they don't want to hurt your feelings. So instead, I coach people to ask questions in a more neutral way. So instead of having them just immediately say how they felt about something positively or negatively, I asked them to just ask the candidate to describe exactly what happened, and as they were describing exactly what happened, tell me what happened at this point in the interview process. Then ask some more neutral questions, like, what did you think? How did that make you feel? Something that didn't really have a leading tone to it. The next method we covered was a method in human-centered design called journey mapping. And so the purpose of a journey map is to clarify where in the candidate experience these pain points live. I gave everyone in the team a worksheet that looked kind of like this. And in this worksheet, it said, for every given phase of the interview process, who were the people you interacted with? What were the digital or physical touch points that you had? And what did you feel at this point in time? And so as people worked in pairs, they interviewed their counterpart to better understand, at this phase of your interview process, how did you feel? Who did you interact with? Is this a place where you look to the company website for more information, or did you go to some secondary sources like Glassdoor? And that helped us uncover, okay, what are the different things that candidates are consulting at different points of the interview process? Where do they feel confused? Where do they feel frustrated? And this really helped us better understand where these pain points existed. The next phase that we covered was related to doing something that we like to call paper prototyping. Now, the word prototype probably doesn't sound very intimidating to most of you, but it sounds pretty intimidating if you imagine leading the session for a group of new hires who might be starting in departments that are unrelated to product development. Someone who's starting in the marketing team, someone who's starting in finance. They were like, prototype? What do you want me to do? I'm not a designer. And so in order to get people comfortable with the idea of paper prototyping, to get feedback on all areas of your hiring process outside your department specifically, I would recommend making sure that it's very clear that prototyping means a lot of different things. I would give them tools to make sure that they're comfortable sketching. So maybe just blank printer paper, nothing fancy, some very simple pens to work with, and make sure that they realize that prototyping doesn't mean sketching an interface. It could also mean sketching what an email might look like for an email they wish they got at some part of the interviewing process. It could mean a phone script. So if they had a phone call with a recruiter and they realized that someone else who interviewed for the same role had a very different kind of phone call, maybe one of the solutions they might recommend is to make sure there was some kind of guideline so people had a consistent experience. And if that's the case, the prototype is pretty simple. It's just a script. In this part of the onboarding session, we also made sure to time box the activity to about 5 to 7 minutes for each person, and that we paired them up again and had them get feedback on these prototypes with each other. And this was a chance to address, hey, do these prototypes actually map out to the pain points that we uncovered earlier? And if so, do they solve the problem? Why or why not? The last step that we went through was to go forth and try to put some of these solutions out in the real world. We wanted to focus on solutions that we thought could be implemented pretty quickly, things that we could get some quick feedback on. So I would say that for this step of the interview process, this part of the session, to focus on making sure that you're spending a lot of your time on stakeholder management, because that's where the difference between executing on this successfully or unsuccessfully will come. So in our case, we made sure that someone from the talent team who was a part of this process was in the room, that they were involved and had a role as we were conducting a couple of these different activities, that they made sure to be there when, at the end of the session, we had people present back to the group the different solutions they had thought of, and that they were there to answer some questions in case candidates wanted to better understand, is there a reason why we're not doing this today? And I think for each of you, you're all hiring managers, probably involved in the interview process to some degree. You can really have an opportunity to lead the way by offering to implement some of these ideas, if they're pretty quick wins, for roles that you're hiring for first. Because if you do all of this work and you're talking about all of the ideas that your team has for improving the hiring process, and some of the easiest things to implement aren't implemented quickly by the person leading the project, then people might start to feel like there's no point in providing that feedback. So if you're able to, I would really recommend trying to lead the way and implementing some of those changes and just seeing what kind of feedback you get. It's very possible that the first few ideas you try implementing might not go over so well, but that's the beauty of making sure that you have a process built in to make it iterative. So I've talked a little bit about why I started working on this in the first place and what were the ways that we tried to introduce this to our organization. Now I just want to share a couple stories that help illustrate some of the things we did in order to change our hiring process, in order to implement some of the ideas that we uncovered through these human-centered design methods. So one story I heard quite often from candidates, one pain point we heard over and over again, was that, as a candidate said, several different people were constantly emailing me to schedule next steps. I had no idea who was in charge of the hiring process, who really owned me as a candidate. It was hard to keep their names and their positions straight. And if I had a question, I wasn't sure who to go to. Do I email just the one person? Do I email everyone and CC everyone? They were pretty confused. And this really addresses a pain point that is relevant for your organization if you're trying to build a strong employer brand. Because you don't want it to appear to the candidate that, your team is disorganized, that you're not aligned on who's responsible for what part of the process, because the candidate could draw from that translates to other disorganization within your company. So one activity we did in order to address this was actually pretty simple. We clarified the roles of everyone involved in the interview process. And we realized, actually, through this activity of journey mapping, that there were a couple different roles that were related to this process. So usually, for any given candidate, there was a talent person who was responsible for the candidate, and there was also a department head who was responsible. But these people typically had different roles, although sometimes it wasn't quite clear to them, especially if some of them, like me, were responsible for hiring for the first time in this particular organization, because it's different with every organization. But in our case, we uncovered that there are two steps to having a successful candidate experience. And the analogy I'll draw here is with two different tools in a UX designer's toolkit. One is something called a journey map. And a journey map helps you uncover what is the candidate experiencing at every step in the process. There's something else that's a little different. It's called a service blueprint. The service blueprint is all of the behind-the-scenes operations that support that candidate experience. And it's actually very similar to this picture, which is quite relevant to us today, right? So the front of the stage is everything that you, as the audience, see. This is the candidate experience. And backstage, there are people working hard to make sure that all the different elements of what you're experiencing today run successfully. And that's the difference between the journey map that uncovers the candidate experience and the service blueprint that covers the back of the scenes operations. And so in this case, we realized in our hiring process at our organization, the role of the talent person was to help the candidate navigate that journey. They helped them uncover different roadblocks in their process as they went through this candidate experience. And on the other side, the hiring manager was typically responsible for the decision-making process for some of the smaller decisions that would lead to that candidate experience. So in my case, for our team, some of the decisions I made were who was the person who was part of the interview panel, what tools did I give them, what information did I give them about the candidate as they head into that interview. These are all things the candidate doesn't quite see or realize is going on, but I'm responsible for them. And sitting down and clarifying these roles and articulating them with the partner on our talent team was really helpful, because sometimes you could have two people who are owning this candidate experience, and they might think a particular responsibility is being covered by the other person. And the reality is what happens is no one ends up doing it, and the candidate is very confused. So going through this activity was something we implemented to address that pain point we heard over and over again. Another story we heard quite often was that it was really frustrating for me as a candidate that interviewers kept asking me some of the same questions over and over again. So the candidate felt that at every stage, people were asking some of the same information gathering questions over and over again. It made them feel that people weren't listening to each other on the talent team or the hiring panel, and they weren't really aligned on what was important and what was being assessed at every stage of the interview process. And this is actually, it sounds like it's related to candidate experience goal, but it's also related to the goal of cutting the bias out of the process. The problem here was that interviewers often didn't have the resources in order to assess candidates fairly and effectively. So we went through this exercise where we had new hires go through and create these journey maps, right? And what we realized was now they had a better understanding of what happened in every stage of the interview process, but very often the interviewer who's pulled in at the last minute to assess a candidate, they don't actually know where they fit into the candidate experience. So what we did was we created an interviewer guide for different stages of the interview process. And at the very top of the interviewer guide, and here's an example, is that you can see we blocked out, here are the different stages of the interviewee's experience, and here's where you fit in specifically. You're the fourth person who interviewed them. They talked to these other departments before. They've been assessed for a couple of other things before, and you're here to assess them on this. And in this interviewer guide, we also had an agenda for this particular type of interview. We had some recommended steps that they should take before the interview to prepare. And we had some guidelines on what particular characteristics they should assess the candidate on in this particular interview. And in addition to creating an interviewer guide, we also created a note-taking template. And this note-taking template would help them detail exactly what was said during the interview and exactly what the candidate said back as it related to each of these different characteristics we wanted them to assess. And this is related to cutting the bias out of the interview process because these notes would then be read by someone else. And one of the things we realized that happened pretty often was that people might interpret the way a candidate gives an answer slightly differently. And it may have something to do with their personality. Most of the time is where that bias came from. So something that happens quite often that interviewers typically disagree on is a candidate takes a while to get to the point when they answer a question, right? So you ask a candidate a question, and they talk for quite a bit of time, and they kind of then remember what the question was about, and then they finally answer the question. I know I've done this as a candidate. And for different types of interviewers with different personalities, they might interpret this differently. So some interviewers interpret this as, oh, the candidate's just a little nervous. Like, they know the answer to the question, and they're taking some time to get to it because, they're nervous. Other interviewers interpret this as, oh, they're not a very good communicator. They don't really know what they're talking about. Maybe they're not really good at listening in order to respond to the question. But a lot of times, whether you interpret the candidate's answer in one way or the other, it's probably a little bit dependent on your own personality. And so what we did was we made sure that the note-taking template was structured in a way so that the interviewer was responsible for writing down exactly what was said, and there would be a second person who was a part of the process who would then assess, based on exactly what was said, how did this map out to what the interviewer's conclusion was. And they did that not only for that particular interviewer, but also for everyone throughout the interview process. So I've talked to you about a couple of different things, and I just want to quickly recap what we talked about today. The first thing we covered is that hiring can be frustrating, it's stressful, but most importantly, it's pretty expensive if you're not taking the time to improve it constantly. If you're trying to get buy-in from your leadership team in order to improve the process, you not only want to talk about the costs of the time you're putting in today, but also the opportunity costs of not trying to improve it sooner rather than later. And if you're trying to build a more intentional and inclusive hiring process, some goals you can shoot towards are to cut the bias out of the process, to make the candidate experience more delightful, and to increase the yield of the candidates who accept an offer once it's been extended. Some methods you can use to get there include conducting user interviews to uncover pain points in the candidate experience, journey mapping the candidate experience in order to understand where those pain points live and who's responsible for delivering the experiences that lead to those pain points and how you can fix them, and then helping come up with ideas and bringing them to life through paper prototyping. Some quick wins that we've identified that have worked for us include clarifying the roles of who's responsible in every part of the interview process and creating resources to help interviewers so they can do their jobs more effectively. Thank you.